Her breath came in sharp, broken gasps as she pushed through the doorway. The little girl's shoes were soaked, her hands trembling as she reached out and clutched the sleeve of the nearest man she could find. Her voice cracked when she spoke, barely louder than a whisper. "Please, they're hurting my mama." The room froze. Cutlery stopped mid-air. Conversations collapsed into silence. Every head turned, not toward the child but toward the man she had chosen. Because the man she was holding onto was not a stranger. He was Antonio Moretti. In this city, his name wasn't spoken casually. It was whispered, feared, bade. Men crossed streets to avoid his gaze. Businesses survived or failed based on his silence. And now, standing before him, was a little girl no older than 7, terrified, desperate, and completely unaware of the rules she had just shattered. What happened next would change more than one life. Stay with me until the end of this story, because the decision Antonio Moretti made that night shocked everyone who witnessed it. Before we begin, remember to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. It was a late evening in the city, and the restaurant pulsed with quiet authority. Polished wood, soft lighting, expensive suits. This wasn't a place people wandered into by accident. This was Moretti territory. Every waiter knew when not to listen. Every guest knew when not to speak. You respected the space or you left. Antonio sat at his usual table, posture calm, expression unreadable. Years of power had taught him precision, control, distance. Emotion was a luxury he'd buried long ago. Then the doors opened, and a child stepped inside, bringing chaos, fear, and a plea that would test everything Antonio believed about power, mercy, and himself. Antonio Moretti did not need to raise his voice to be heard. His presence alone bent the room around him. He sat at the corner table as he always did, back straight, hands relaxed, dark suit immaculate. The lighting never quite reached his eyes, and that was by design. Men who dealt with Antonio learned early that you didn't look too long, didn't ask unnecessary questions, and never mistook his silence for kindness. Silence was how decisions were made. Silence was how futures ended. Around him, the restaurant moved with careful precision. Waiters approached only when summoned. Conversations nearby stayed low, respectful, stripped of humor. Everyone knew the rules. You conducted business efficiently. You paid what you owed. You left emotions at the door. This place was neutral ground only because Antonio allowed it to be. For decades, he had built his empire the same way. Methodically, without spectacle. Territory expanded not through chaos, but through calculation. Rivals disappeared not in public displays, but in quiet corrections. Antonio believed fear worked best when it didn't announce itself. When people behaved because they remembered what had happened the last time someone didn't. He watched the room without moving his head, catching reflections in polished glass, reading posture, measuring loyalty. Every man at his table owed him something. Money, protection, forgiveness. Antonio kept careful account of all three. Debts were remembered long after apologies were forgotten. Once long ago people said he had been different. Warmer. That version of Antonio felt like a story belonging to someone else now. He had buried that man under years of discipline and loss, replacing him with rules that could not betray him. Rule 1. Never let emotion interfere with judgment. Rule 2. Mercy must serve a purpose. Rule 3. Attachments create leverage. These rules had kept him alive. They had kept him powerful. And they had kept him alone. Antonio lifted his glass, listening as figures were discussed, problems reduced to numbers. Everything was contained, predictable. Then, somewhere behind him, a door opened where it never should have. And for the first time in years, Antonio Moretti felt something shift. Subtle, unfamiliar. As the world he controlled prepared to challenge him. The first sound was not screaming. It was the door. It opened too fast, striking the wall with a sharp crack that sliced through the low murmur of the room. Conversations faltered. Glasses paused mid-lift. Chairs stopped scraping. For a heartbeat, no one moved, as if the building itself was deciding how to respond to a mistake. Then she stepped inside. She was small. Too small to belong in a place like this. Her dress was wrinkled and stained, clinging to her thin frame as if she'd been running for a long time. One of her shoes was missing. Her hair fell loose around her face, tangled and damp, framing eyes that were wide with fear and something worse, determination born from desperation. The maitre d' rushed forward, color draining from his face. "Miss, you can't." His voice died when he saw her properly. When he saw her hands shaking. When he saw the way she looked past him, past everyone, as if none of them mattered. Because she wasn't here for permission. She scanned the room the way someone drowning scans the surface of water. Frantic, searching, running out of time. Men turned away, uncomfortable. Others frowned, annoyed at the disruption. A few muttered under their breath, already deciding she was someone else's problem. But Isabella wasn't looking for sympathy. Her gaze locked onto the corner table. Something in her seemed to recognize it. Not the man, not his face, but the weight around him. The way space bent. The way no one sat too close. The way even grown men measured their words in his presence. To a child who had just watched her world collapse, that gravity felt like hope. She moved. Gasps rippled through the room as she ran straight past the maitre d', past frozen patrons, toward the one table no one approached without invitation. Chairs shifted. Jackets rustled. Antonio's men stiffened, hands instinctively moving, eyes sharp. This did not happen. Ever. Before anyone could stop her, Isabella reached the table. She grabbed the sleeve of Antonio Moretti's suit with both hands, clutching the dark fabric as if letting go would mean losing everything. Her voice came out small and broken, but it carried. "Please," she said. "They're hurting my mama." The room went silent. Antonio looked down at the child holding on to him, and for the first time in years, the rules he lived by failed to tell him what to do next. The words didn't come all at once. Isabella's grip tightened, her fingers curling into the sleeve of Antonio's jacket as if the fabric were the only thing holding her upright. She swallowed hard, chest trembling, eyes shining with tears she no longer tried to stop. "They're killing my mama." 3 words. Simple. Even. Spoken with the quiet certainty of a child who had already seen too much. Something in the room shifted. Antonio didn't move right away. He felt the weight of her hands before he felt the meaning of her words. They landed slowly, settling somewhere deep, where rules and habits didn't reach. Around them the tension thickened. His men waited, reading his posture, searching his face for instruction. One sharp command would end this. One nod, and the child would be removed, the moment erased. That was how things were done. Antonio looked down. Isabella's face was turned up toward him, streaked with dirt and tears. There was fear there, pure, unfiltered, but beneath it was something else. Trust. Not earned. Not reasoned. Given freely because she had nothing else left to give. He had seen men beg before. Grown men. Dangerous men. They begged when they were cornered. When they wanted mercy they never offered others. Those pleas had never moved him. Fear he understood. Desperation he could calculate. This was different. This was not bargaining. This was not manipulation. This was a child telling the truth because the truth was all she had. Antonio felt a tightness spread through his chest, slow and unwelcome. A memory stirred, uninvited, of another voice long gone, calling his name in a kitchen filled with morning light. He pushed it down the way he always did. He had buried that man for a reason. Isabella sniffed, her voice breaking again. "I didn't know where else to go." The honesty of it struck harder than the words themselves. Around them, the room held its breath. No one spoke. No one dared interrupt the moment hanging between the most feared man in the city and the smallest person who had ever challenged him. Antonio exhaled slowly. For the first time in decades, the rules he lived by felt insufficient. And for the first time, Antonio Moretti understood that whatever he chose to do next, there would be no turning back. Antonio Moretti had learned long ago how to survive memories. You didn't fight them. You didn't indulge them. You buried them under routine, under rules, under the steady repetition of days that asked nothing of your heart. That was how he had lasted this long. That was how he had remained standing when others had fallen apart. But as Isabella stood before him, her small hand still clutching his sleeve, the past rose anyway. There had been a time when his world had been smaller, quieter. A narrow apartment filled with the smell of coffee in the morning and music playing low in the evenings. A woman who laughed easily and believed, foolishly, that the future could be shaped by hope instead of fear. She had looked at Antonio once and told him he was more than the life he lived. He had believed her. That belief had cost him everything. The night she was taken from him had not been loud or dramatic. It had been efficient, cruel in its simplicity. When Antonio arrived too late, the silence that greeted him was heavier than any sound. From that moment on, he understood the truth no one had taught him. Love created openings. Openings were invitations. And invitations were fatal. So he closed himself. He built walls brick by brick. Discipline, distance, control. He stopped dreaming. He stopped imagining a future that included anyone else. Power replaced affection. Fear replaced trust. And the emptiness that followed became familiar enough to live with. That man, the one who might have been a husband, a father, was buried alongside the life he lost. Antonio had not thought of her in years. Not consciously. He told himself that remembering served no purpose. It didn't bring her back. It didn't change the rules of the world. All it did was weaken resolve. Yet now, looking at Isabella's tear-streaked face, he felt the echo of something he thought was gone. Not grief. Something quieter. Heavier. Regret. He realized, with an unfamiliar ache, that this child was standing exactly where he once stood. Alone, afraid, and hoping someone stronger would choose to care. Antonio straightened slowly. The walls around his heart did not crumble. But for the first time in decades they cracked. And through that fracture, a question slipped in, one he had avoided his entire life. What kind of man would he be if he turned away now? Antonio moved first. He rose from his chair with controlled urgency, Isabella's hand still wrapped tightly in his sleeve as if letting go might undo the moment. He signaled once, sharp, economical, and the room obeyed. Chairs shifted back. Voices stayed silent. One of his men was already moving ahead to clear a path. The night air outside was cold, biting. Isabella struggled to keep up, her breaths shallow, her lips moving in silent words that sounded like prayers even before Antonio realized what she was doing. "It's close," she whispered, as if afraid the city might hear her. "Mama told me not to be scared. She said God watches us." Antonio said nothing. He didn't trust his voice. The car ride felt longer than it was. Sirens wailed somewhere far away, uncaring. Isabella stared out the window, her fingers pressed together, her eyes darting every time the car slowed. She kept glancing at Antonio, not to speak, but to make sure he was still there. They stopped in front of a small storefront squeezed between shuttered businesses. The sign above it was crooked, one light flickering weakly. Inside, the air smelled of crushed flowers and broken glass. Pots lay shattered. Petals were scattered across the floor like something beautiful had been deliberately undone. Isabella froze. Antonio followed her gaze. Behind the counter, her mother lay motionless. Blood darkened the floor beneath her, her chest rising unevenly, each breath shallow and uncertain. One arm was bent at an unnatural angle, her fingers still curled as if she had tried to protect something. Money, dignity, her child. "Mama," Isabella whispered. Antonio caught her before she could run forward, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. He felt her trembling, felt the weight of her fear sink into him. The doctor knelt immediately, voice calm but urgent, hands already working. "She's alive," he said, and the words hit Isabella like a lifeline. "But she needs help now." Isabella closed her eyes, her lips moving faster now. Not asking, begging. Antonio stood there, the devastation of the small shop burning into his memory. This wasn't territory. This wasn't business. This was cruelty disguised as power. He looked at the child praying beside him and understood, with unsettling clarity, what failure would mean. If he did nothing, this world would take everything from her, just as it once had from him. And Antonio Moretti had not come this far to let that happen again. Antonio watched the doctor work. His movements precise, practiced, unhurried in the way only true urgency allowed. The man spoke in clipped sentences to the paramedics who had arrived, names of injuries and instructions passing between them like a language Isabella didn't understand. She stayed close, her hands clasped tight against her chest, eyes never leaving her mother's face. Antonio crouched beside her. "Look at me," he said gently. Isabella hesitated, then turned. Her eyes were red, swollen, searching for something she was afraid to ask for. "She's going to live," Antonio said. He didn't soften it. He didn't hedge. He chose his words the way he chose everything else, with intention. "I won't let anything happen to her." The certainty in his voice made Isabella's breath catch. "You promise?" Antonio nodded once. It was a small motion, but it carried weight. "I promise." Behind them his men paused. They all knew what that meant. Antonio Moretti did not make promises lightly. He made them only when he was prepared to reshape the world to keep them. He stood and spoke quietly into his phone. Hospital was notified. Private rooms secured. Security arranged. Names were mentioned. Doctors who owed favors, administrators who answered calls at any hour. The city moved because he told it to. As the stretcher was lifted, Isabella reached for her mother's hand, brushing her fingers against cold skin. "I'll be good," she whispered. "I'll do everything right." Antonio felt something tighten again in his chest. He placed his coat gently around Isabella's shoulders, the fabric far too large for her small frame. She looked up at him, startled. "You're coming with us," he said. "You won't be alone." The ambulance doors closed, sirens cutting through the night. Antonio followed in his car, watching the red lights ahead of him paint the streets in brief flashes of urgency. This wasn't a favor. It wasn't charity. It was a line crossed. At the hospital, while doctors rushed Isabella's mother into surgery, Antonio sat with the child in a quiet corner. She leaned against him without asking, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. "I didn't think anyone would help," she murmured. Antonio looked down at her, at the trust she offered without knowing who he was. "You came to the right place," he said. And in that moment, Antonio Moretti committed to more than saving a life. He committed to standing between this child and the world that had tried to break her. The city did not sleep that night. While surgeons worked behind closed doors and Isabella drifted into an uneasy rest beneath hospital lights, Antonio Moretti stood apart. His phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and measured. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He didn't need to. The men on the other end understood the tone. It meant decisions had already been made. Names surfaced quickly. 2 men. Small-time enforcers who mistook fear for authority. They had been loud about it, careless in their confidence, bragging in places where walls remembered more than they should. Antonio listened without interruption, filing away details with the same precision he used to manage territory. "Alive," he said at last. "I want them breathing." The instructions spread outward like ripples. Cars moved. Doors opened that were not meant to open. Somewhere across the city, laughter died mid-sentence as hands closed around shoulders and mouths were covered before words could form. The men were taken without spectacle. No sirens. No witnesses. Just absence where arrogance had been moments before. Antonio arrived later, after ensuring Isabella was guarded, after confirming the doctor's first update. The warehouse was quiet, concrete walls swallowing sound. The 2 men sat restrained, their bravado stripped away, eyes darting as they recognized where they were. Antonio entered without ceremony. They tried to speak at once, excuses tumbling over each other, explanations that grew thinner with every word. He let them talk. He always did. Men revealed themselves when they believed they still had time. "You don't understand," one of them said. "We were just collecting." Antonio raised a hand. Silence fell instantly. "You thought power meant hurting someone who couldn't fight back," he said calmly. "You thought cruelty made you important." He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor. "You were wrong." They shifted in their seats, fear finally settling in. This was not negotiation. This was reckoning. Antonio didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to describe consequences. The men before him understood exactly who he was and what he represented. He was the end of roads people like them never believed they would reach. "You broke something that didn't belong to you," Antonio continued. "A home. A child's sense of safety." He turned away then, already finished. "Make sure they never forget the lesson," he said to his men. "But let them live long enough to understand it." As he walked back toward the waiting car, Antonio felt no satisfaction. Only clarity. Power was not cruelty. And tonight, he had decided what it was for. The consequences came quietly. No headlines followed. No sirens cut through the night. By morning, the city moved as it always did, unaware that something had shifted beneath its surface. People woke, opened their shops, walked their children to school. They didn't know that a line had been drawn and crossed behind closed doors. The men responsible were gone, not erased but changed. Stripped of the arrogance that had made them careless. They would walk again, speak again, breathe again, but the memory of that night would follow them longer than any scar. Antonio ensured it would. Justice in his world was not about spectacle. It was about permanence. When he left the warehouse, the weight he carried was different. Not lighter, clearer. At the hospital, the night stretched on. Machines hummed softly. Isabella slept curled on her side, clutching the edge of Antonio's coat like a lifeline. He remained nearby, seated just outside the operating wing, unmoving. His phone stayed silent now. Everything that needed to be done had been done. For the first time in years, Antonio waited. Hours passed before the surgeon finally emerged. He removed his mask slowly, exhaustion etched into his face. "She made it," he said. "She'll need time. But she's alive." Antonio closed his eyes just briefly. He hadn't realized he was holding his breath. When Isabella woke, it was still dark outside. She blinked in confusion, then remembered. Her eyes searched the room until they found him. Antonio stood as she sat up, uncertainty flickering across her face. "My mama?" she asked. "She's sleeping," he said softly. "And she's going to wake up." Isabella's shoulders sagged as relief overtook her. Tears came then, not sharp and frantic like before, but quiet. She wiped them quickly, embarrassed. Antonio knelt in front of her. "What happened to you and your mother was wrong," he said. "And it won't happen again." She studied him with the seriousness only children possessed. "Did you make them stop?" "Yes," he answered. "And they'll remember why." Isabella nodded, satisfied. To her that was enough. As dawn crept through the hospital windows, Antonio realized something had been decided. Not by violence, not by fear, but by choice. He could have returned to the man he had been. The rules would still hold. The city would still obey. But behind closed doors, justice had taken a different shape. And Antonio Moretti would never be the same again. Morning arrived softly, as if the city itself was careful not to disturb what had changed overnight. Sunlight filtered through the hospital window, resting gently on Isabella's face as she slept. Her breathing was even now, her small hand no longer clenched in fear but relaxed against the blanket. Antonio stood nearby, watching in silence. He had guarded many things in his life: territory, secrets, power, but never like this. This was different. This mattered. When Isabella's mother finally opened her eyes, it happened quietly. No dramatic gasp. Just a slow return, like someone finding their way back from a long, dark hallway. Isabella noticed first. She froze, then leaned forward, her voice trembling as she said, "Mama." The woman turned her head, confusion giving way to recognition. Tears followed, weak but real. Isabella climbed carefully onto the bed, wrapping her arms around her mother as if afraid the moment might disappear if she let go. Antonio stepped back, giving them space. He didn't belong in that embrace. He knew it. And yet he had made it possible. Later, when the room had settled and nurses moved in quiet routines, Isabella approached him again. She looked smaller now that the fear had loosened its grip, but her eyes were steady. "You stayed," she said. Antonio nodded. "I told you I would." She considered this, then slipped her hand into his without hesitation. "You're not scary," she said simply. The words struck deeper than any insult or praise ever had. Antonio felt the final wall give way. Not collapse but open. He understood then that fear had never been the source of his strength. It had only been a tool. What stood before him now was something else entirely. He arranged everything that followed without ceremony. Protection, support, a future untouched by the shadows that had once ruled his decisions. Not because he owed a debt, but because this was who he chose to be. As Antonio Moretti walked out into the daylight, the city remained the same. His name still carried weight. His reputation still held. But somewhere between a hospital room and a child's quiet trust, the most feared man in the city had become something else. Not a ruler. Not a threat. Shield. And for the first time in his life, Antonio Moretti wore that role without fear.